secretary of the format at half-time. Got to the restaurant, it ran
and Grandma. Hello, Grandma. This is Uncle Jules's. Daniel's supposed to be doing it, but I've been numbered with it.
Yeah, rehearsal the other day.
Yes. And Mary. Hello to the camera.
Plan for your life. This is what I've done for my kids.
Hello, Sash. How you doing?
No, Jules is great for doing this sort of video.
Okay, well, I'm picking my car up tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.
Everyone, the whole family.
Get those dope fucking
Please, this is Uncle Jules's.
Oh, right.
It's weird. It must be auntie Carrie.
Too old.
This is not mine, by the way. Alex is 18 months now. Hello, ladies. This is for our camera for today. Our video camera. Hello, Carla.
Piss off. Alan, piss off.
One more Grandma.
Take Auntie Mary.
Yes.
Sarah.
I'm going round the whole room. I will. I'm going round, everyone. Mary, another one for the camera. Lovely. Susie, I've got you.
Oh, you did, Sasha.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Keep your glasses off. Lovely. Looking excellent.
Well, my name is Sylvia Graff. I was born Sylvia Smith in Sussex, Cutfield, in 1918, and that makes me 86 years old. And quite recently I had a party here with all my 5 children and a lot of my grandchildren and their partners, which was lovely.
Candid camera! Are you looking at a reality TV show?
I'll say, yeah, we're in the flat.
Grandma, check this out!
The dream come true! That's the window!
And that's Robbie. That's the usual.
How to be the most
Danny was supposed to be doing this. I get lovage of it.
I saw Ash where it was party.
My agent charges a fortune for these photos.
I'm sure they do.
And I'd like to recall some of my earliest memories. We lived in a house in Casenoe Road, which was not unlike Elgin Avenue. It was a long, leafy, tree-lined road, which was very, very elegant. The houses were well built and not exactly like these, not the depth of the width and the depth. I understand this room is a double cube, according to architects, whatever that means. It's something architectural. And you see, I'm going off on a tangent.
It doesn't matter, Mum. You just talk.
Yes, well, we lived in a house, and it was number 126 Casenoe Road, and it was very near
Stamford Hill or
Stamford Hill. No, it was very near Clapton. One end of Casenoe Road ended in Clapton, and it was a long avenue like this one here, and the other end ended in Stoke Newington. Well, Clapton was the superior end of the road, and the houses were very large, and we had lovely gardens with orchards. And my memory was that when we moved further down the road to 92 Casenoe Road, which was in the centre of the road, which was it was a lovely house. It was semi-detached, but it was very large, with the steps leading up to a door and porticos and sort of classic columns, I think, if I remember. Well, I was only about three and a bit, and I remember one of the gardeners that used to be employed by my father had pushed me in a wheelbarrow from 126 to 92 with some old plants that were going to be repotted into the new garden. And that was one of the earliest memories, and sitting on a bucket, which is not very nice actually, because our cat had 11 kittens, and I think several of them were drowned, and I hadn't realised that sitting on this bucket with a plank over it, I hadn't realised that I was instrumental in causing their death, which when I thought about it many years later, I thought how unkind my mum was to have sat me down on that little place. However, I have, Sarah wasn't born, Frida wasn't born when we moved, and well, Frida might have been because there's 3 years difference. I can't remember much of Tilly. David I remember very well because we used to sleep quite near one another, and he was quite a sickly child, and I was actually in my school days, not at this age. I used to go to a little nursery school with my cousins who lived next door, and every afternoon we were put on little bunks, little canvas bunks to sleep, and I remember that so distinctly. It was quite near. We lived in Cazenove Road, and this little nursery school was in Osbodeston Road, which was one of the turnings of Cazenove Road.
Can you remember who your cousins were?
Oh yes, there was Hetty and Frida and David and Sissy.
And they
lived next door, and we were in each other's houses the whole of our youth. I don't know how they established their factory when they came over from Poland, but apparently by the time I was growing up it was a very well established business, public company, and he had several public companies actually. He was chairman of several public companies. I used to watch him get dressed in the mornings because I used to be in my mum's bed, and it was all lovely, all the smells of their bodies. I used to be ill with, as I said, tonsillitis and quinces. So, and I used to enjoy being ill because I used to get into my mummy's bed.
I don't think anything's changed about that.
And it was all lovely and soft, and I used to watch him getting dressed, and he used to wear those the Jaeger long pants, what do they call them?
Long johns.
Long johns.
Yeah.
And he used to tuck his shirt in and then powder his face with swan's down powder with a great big puff. They had a most beautiful bedroom. It had Chinese furniture and Chinese wallpaper, and I always used to think that the figures that were in the wallpaper and on the furniture would come out and be like a little sort of Chinese family. One's imagination.
Yeah, as a child, both your parents came from Poland.
Yes, and I think my father came from Warsaw, well, around there, and my mother was from Krakow, I believe. Not absolutely certain. Why didn't I find out before everybody died?
Well, this is one reason why we're doing this, so we can remember what we can remember and have some record of it. And do you know, were they married in Poland before they came over, or were they married in England?
They were married here. Let me see, 18 I was born. Tilly, David was 18 months older than me. Tilly was 4 years older. They must have been married about 1912 or 13. Now that should have all been, I should have had all those papers, shouldn't I?
And they probably, without knowing, they might well have come over 1904, 1905.
Yes, I think in the early 1900s, yes, they did come over. And my mother worked in a cigarette factory, and that's where my father met her. Here, in London. And I was always very sorry to think that my mum had to work. It used to upset me to think that she, you know, hadn't come from a wealthy family, although her grandfather was an inspector of trains, I believe. So that was the story, and I think myths grow up in the telling of stories, don't you think?
Yes. Possible. Some of them are.
Yes, I knew this was going to be disjointed because my thoughts are jumping hither and
Doesn't
thither.
matter, man. It doesn't matter.
Yes, and watching my father get dressed, those were the days. And then he'd tuck his shirt in his pants, and he'd wriggle his body, and so he'd powder his face, and then he'd get dressed. And I think by all this time he's drinking his tea and having a bit of toast. And then at that time they were still having cars and chauffeurs, and I'm talking about in the early 1920s. And he used to wait outside for the car to come and pick him up. Financial Times under his arm, and his trilby hat, and his lovely overcoat, which was of good quality, and go off to Leabridge Road, where they had two of their factories. One was the box making, and the other one was the British Celluloid, which covered the boxes with this cellophane coating.
Which particular boxes are we talking
Cigarette boxes, but they made boxes for cereals and for Kotex sanitary pads. It was quite varied business.
And it's still going,
Well, the business is still going, but it's no longer in the hands of the Smiths.
No.
And it was sold several times, and it had been a very successful, well, my mother and father used to go on European trips every year, and the wonderful hat boxes that she had, mind you, pigskin, this would absolutely appall Josephine, but wonderful wardrobe trunks with all the drawers, and we used to rummage in these drawers and stand inside these wardrobe trunks, and amidst all her evening dresses, because they used to go on cruises and be invited to the captain's day. I don't know how, because my father wasn't very well educated, but he had a good appearance, and she was very beautiful, my mother, very elegant, plump at the time, but she'd slimmed out later on. At the time of talking.
I want to take you back just a little bit earlier. You mentioned that you were actually born in Cuckfield.
Ah, yes.
And I asked you last week when we were here, how come you were in Cuckfield, and you explained. I wonder if you could recall
Yes,
that again.
well, I think as far as I remember the story, that's during the end of the First World War, because I was born in 1918, round about 1917, the family moved to Cuckfield. My father was never called up, he or his brother, because they were making uniforms for the army, in addition to running the box factory. And they moved to Sussex, and that's where I was born.
Why did they move out of London at that moment?
Well, I think that London was being, I don't know whether London was being bombed in the First World War. Yes, it was. And they moved, well, there were three of us at the time. There was Tilly, David and myself, and Mary, who was a tiny baby. I can't remember much about Mary in early childhood. Frida I remember, because she's 3.5 years younger. Mary was only 18 months younger than myself. And I suppose the three of us, or four of us, had moved. My mother had taken her four little babes to Sussex, out of danger.
Okay.
And many years later, on one of the occasions that I'd left Henry, went to Brighton, to the Metropole Hotel, where my father at some stage in the early 30s had a suite of rooms, and they used to go there every weekend. Yes, oh, I can't tell you the wealth, as I now realise, didn't know at the time, didn't realise at the time. And I stayed at the Metropole, and then I took a bus into Cuckfield. Yes, it's a pity I haven't got more information, but I'll be able to tell you what I remember of them. And there are some very interesting characteristics which are very amusing actually these days. My grandfather had a long beard, and when he used to come and visit my mother, he used to come perhaps on a Friday, but he would, if the Sabbath was about to start, he would walk from the East End to Casenope Road. He wouldn't ride on the Sabbath. And he used to spend the weekend with my mother and father and the little children. We used to climb up on his knee and comb his beard, and what he called making lux, and I don't know what that meant, but it was a loving sort of relationship that we had with him. And he used to comb his hair and comb his beard, and he never minded how many of us were sitting on his knee. Probably, if I realised now, he enjoyed it.
This was Debbie's father.
Father.
He was a rabbi,
Well, a Hebrew teacher. We always thought he was a rabbi, but he wasn't. He was a Hebrew teacher.
And his name?
And his name was Emmanuel, Emmanuel Elberg. But subsequently they changed the name to Elberry, which is hardly any difference really. And that's why Uncle Jack was always Jack Elberry, Mummy's youngest brother. He lived with us from a very early age because he was the youngest. Now, my mummy had several sisters. There was Auntie Becky, Auntie Leah, Auntie Polly, Auntie Minnie, who was very clever, and she'd won a scholarship into a grammar school, but because her father needed her to help in his little cafe, he wouldn't allow her to go to grammar school. Oh, she regretted all her life, but she was Jack Gold's mother, and her children are very clever. It's a great pity that she was probably university material, as they say these days. That was a great pity. Talking more about my grandfather, we used to go to his little cafe on a Sunday morning. My father, we used to go, three of us, Mary, Frida and myself, dressed all alike in brown and white and black tweed coats, buttoned up like a Russian jacket with a high collar. A little tailor around in Osbodeston Road used to make our outdoor coats, and my mother used to get reams of, I don't know, masses of materials from my father's sister, who had a shop in Middlesex Street. Gosh, I'm remembering all these things. Yeah. And we were all dressed alike.
I think your nurse is here, so we're going to hold just.
Well, I go into the bedroom.
Alrighty, so the nurse has come, and we were talking about your maternal grandfather.
Yes.
Emmanuel.
Emmanuel, yes.
And I believe he was married twice.
Yes, yes. He'd married this, my mother's stepmother, I suppose, and I think my mother and her sisters never liked his second wife, and there was always a little animosity. And I think she must have had a little restaurant, a little cafe. It wasn't a restaurant. And as I say, my father used to take us on the tram down to this little cafe, and they used to have special cakes, black and white, black and brown icing.
Cheese boats.
Yes, cheese boats.
Yes.
And oh, they were delicious, and I can taste them now.
I can taste them from my childhood, and I can't get them anywhere anymore.
And I think they had a sort of almond filling, didn't they? Almond, some type of filling. And we always had one of those, the three of us, and we used to sit in a corner and eat them, and my father used to chat to my grandfather. It was strange, my mother never took us down there. but I think it's because she didn't like her stepmother.
What happened to this first one?
Well, she died. I don't know whether she died in London or whether she died when they were still in Poland. That I'm not clear about.
Okay, so that's Emmanuel, who was your mum's dad. Can you remember any stories or anything about your father's father?
Well, not about the father, but his mother, I remember very distinctly. She lived with one of Daddy's sisters, Alice, her name was, who was married to this very educated man, had been in Heidelberg University, and he was the father of Joseph Ingram Lindner, who was very fond of me when I was young and advised me not to marry Henry because he was in love with me himself, but we were first cousins. However, Grandma, they had the most wonderful home. This man, as I say, had been educated abroad and had been to somewhere in Switzerland, a university, and he knew how to buy silverware and ebony. He had ebony brushes and what's the white stuff?
Ivory.
Ivory, ebony and ivory, and their dressing table was littered with silver and trays and little boxes with silver tops, and like from a vanity case. And Grandma was a very tall and stately lady, with iron grey hair and typically knotted at the back. She used to wear a chatelaine round her waist with all the keys. She had every cupboard locked in the house, in my aunt's house, because he used to bring in the best wines and all the wonderful food. The house was carpeted throughout. There were Persian rugs everywhere. It was a stately home. Eventually they moved to Bishop's Avenue. When I was married to Henry, went to visit them when I was pregnant with Davida. And the butler opened the door to me, and I was with my friend Vieta, and we went to visit my aunt, who was sitting in a chair similar to this, but in brocade. And the daughter was going to Lucy, my cousin Lucy was going to, she had been to the Cheltenham Ladies' College. And I think she'd won a scholarship to go to one of the universities. Now my cousin Joe was the youngest QC of his day. He was a very clever man, and he sometimes used to help me with my homework, and when I used to hand it in, the note on my returned essay was, "This is not your work."
Can you remember the names of
Now
these
I'm
grandparents?
trying to think about the grandma's name. Well, it was Schmidig, I suppose, her name, and it became Smith. But I don't remember what her Christian name was.
Okay, and granddad?
Well, I didn't know him. Oh, I didn't know anything about my father's father.
Okay.
He must have died in Poland, because I remember when Grandma died, and apparently my father and his brother Coleman, they were heartbroken, and my cousin Lucy came round to our house to be comforted, and we were lying on the bed. She introduced, oh dear, she was the first one. I knew nothing about sex. I must have been about 12. And she was the first one that enlightened me about what goes on. So apart from being upset about my grandma, I was thrilled to hear about something else that goes on in life.
Strange time to hear about it.
Yes,
Isn't it?
it was. She was, yes, teacher. Anyhow, I don't know, she ended up by getting married to somebody who had a pub in Bournemouth, I believe, eventually.
Okay, so we've talked about your grandparents a little bit and what your memories are of them. Let's go back to Cazenove Road with Gabriel and
Yes.
Deborah, your parents.
Uh-huh.
And by that time, David, Tilly,
Tilly, David,
yourself.
Sylvia, Mary and Frida were born. Sarah was 12 years younger. Now in 92 Cazenove Road, we had one of those lifts, what do they call them, where the food goes in?
Dumbwaiter.
Dumbwaiter. And it was big enough for us to crawl into. So very often we would disappear. When I say we, I don't think more than two of the little ones could get into this thing. And of course,
Strange.
I'm not surprised because
When you're talking about riding up and down in the dumbwaiter, who were you closest with at that time? Would it have been Tilly, or would it have been David or Frida?
No, it was David. He and I, we used to say goodnight to one another at least 12 times. He was in a room which was opposite a room that had the tank in it. And every time somebody turned on a tap in the kitchen or went to the loo, so the water would dribble into this tank, and this used to irritate David. It used to frighten him, actually. And I used to share a room with Tilly to start with. And he used to call down, "Good night, Syl," and I used to say, "Good night, Dave," and it went on for half an hour until somebody had fallen asleep. And he had scarlet fever when he was young, and I remember all the house was, all his room was sheeted up with damp sheets to keep the infection. He never went to hospital. And he also had he had a tubercular gland in his neck, and he had an operation on that. And it was my cousin, Joe, who used to come in and tutor him. And he became, as you know, a very ardent socialist, communist over the years. And it was through this Joe's influence, this man who went to Cambridge.
So let me get this right about cousin Joe, who was the youngest QC of his day, came in to see you, to do some education, would educate David because he wasn't well, and this Cambridge educated QC, Queen's Counsel, was the man who introduced socialism and communism into your family.
Yes. Because after leaving the nursery school when I was about 5 and a half, we went to a council school, Northwold Road, which was, I don't know whether it still exists, I don't think it does. But I wasn't there very long. Mary and Frida, my mother decided to send them to a boarding school in Brighton. And I didn't want to be left out, so I was included. But I was only there for 2 terms because I was homesick. Now, there must have been a time in my father's life where they might have been a bit short of money, because like the house we had in Hampstead Garden suburb, with all those rooms on the top floor, Cazenove Road had a bathroom and 3 rooms up there, and it was a flat, a self-contained flat, and a kitchen. And this was let to a young couple who had a baby. And I was about 12 at the time, and I was asked to babysit on several occasions. Now, there was always a packet of Pete Freed's biscuits, and I was told I could open the biscuits and help myself, which I did every time I went up there, and ate all the cream-scented ones with the jam. And to this day, I still like Pete Freed's assorted biscuits. And they weren't there for very long, but that I do remember. But thereafter, the girls that used to stay in these rooms were the girls from Newcastle who used to come in as maids and run the house. And it was always beautifully carpeted, and the doors were closed quietly. I know that my mother and father had quite a tempestuous life, But I never heard any quarrelling. Not me. It seems that everybody else heard them. Perhaps I just ignored them. Perhaps it was just something that I wouldn't accept. But I never heard them quarrel, and the house used to run on oiled wheels, and we had a mother's help, and my mother had a woman that used to come in, Sarah, and she was my mother's confidant, you know. She used to tell her all her problems, and my father was a bit of a, I told you, a bit of a womanizer, and they used to go to these charity balls, and he would misbehave on the dance floor, apparently, and my mother very often would disappear for a weekend, and she would come into the bedroom if we were just sleeping, and all one could see was this beautiful face beneath a lovely sort of veil, and she would kiss us good night or goodbye, and my aunt next door would come in and make certain that the maids were giving us our breakfast and our lunch. And then she would come back again after perhaps 2 or 3 days. She had sisters in Exeter and another one somewhere else, so there was always somewhere she could go for the weekend, just to get away from my father. But she came back, and of course then Henry came into the house. As I say, Jack, my mother's youngest brother, lived with us, and he was like a big brother. He taught Tilly how to dance, especially the tango. I wasn't very keen about dancing when I was younger, and I was, well, not interested, I suppose. And I met Henry when I was about 12 or 13, and he was married at that time. Henry, Jack had met him up in Scotland. Jack used to travel for another, not my father at the time, he used to travel for my other uncles. They were into this, into the therapy business. In the,
Happy childhood?
oh yes, I did. I had a happy childhood.
Cousins next door? And
Oh
lots of
yes, but
sisters
not
and a
only
brother?
next door, my cousins from Osbodeston Road. My father had a twin sister, Mary, and she had 6 children, Toby and Diana, I've forgotten, and also another Sissy. And Toby died a couple of years ago, actually. And his son, one of his sons was a judge, and he's an itinerant judge. Was that when they go around different circuits? And another one went into the box making business. I think Toby went into the box making business on his own. He was trained in my father's factory. His father was employed there, a clever man, and Gurlis, his name was Gurlis. Yes, and all these cousins used to come in, and there were my cousins from Joe Lindner and his brothers that used to come in, and Lucy. And my mother's sisters, there was Ellis, Sarah, and another Sarah, and my Aunt Leah, she had a son and a daughter, a Sarah, and yes, you see, there were hundreds of cousins, well, not hundreds, but lots of happy childhood memories, really, and parties. I remember my 7th birthday, I had a big party, and a pretty dress that my own mother made for me, pure silk, and it had a skirt underneath, fluffed out, and oh yes, and I was able to invite all my friends, and I think we didn't have an entertainer. I don't think we had them in those days, but we had a lovely tea and played games.
That was your 7th?
Yes, my 7th birthday. Now, in our house, it was beautifully furnished. In the dining room, there were, I think, 5 or 6 bedrooms, and there was the downstairs room that was like as big as this room, with a kitchen this size and pantries, and great big refrigerators and a massive gas stove. Because my aunts used to come on a Wednesday to pluck chickens for the weekend, and they used to go down to the East End to get the fish to fry and to make for the weekend, because everybody used to mingle the weekends. Everybody came into our house, and the men used to go to the synagogue on a Saturday morning and come in for play McCain. They used to have kiddush, come in for a glass of wine. What they did afterwards, I remember seeing my Uncle Max smoking, and he quickly, when he saw me coming towards him, he stamped it out. You know, they had respect for the youngsters. What am I trying? It's childhood.
Just childhood memories. Just an enormous
Oh
great
yes,
family.
and then there were friends, Emmanuel Kleiman, that's right, my first kiss. When my brother had his bar mitzvah at 13, we all took a walk in the afternoon to Clissold Park, and we were very friendly with this family she must have come from Germany, and his father, and they had 2 sons, and they lived a very austere life, very well disciplined, not austere, more disciplined as the German children were brought up, or the children of German parents were very disciplined, and but he was allowed out on a Saturday, and we all went to Clissold Park, and that's where he kissed me, and it was lovely. I was only, David 30, I was only 11. It was my first kiss. Well, my first sort of
Time in your mum's life when it wasn't. She
Oh,
wasn't
no.
so wealthy that
Oh,
she
no.
didn't have everything she needed. What happened?
The family went bankrupt.
When was that, and why was that?
That was in 37, 38.
So they weren't affected by the big depression in the late 20s? And
No,
20 crash?
not 29, no. In fact, the family flourished. They used to go on, on cruises, and my aunt and uncle used to go away. There are flies, I hate them. No, I tell you what happened. When my father, although he wasn't an inventor, he was surrounded by people who knew how to do things with machines. And my father had this idea of putting this cellophane over boxes to keep the cigarettes fresh. And they built a factory in Leabridge Road. I wish that I'd had some of the cards with the printing of the factory and all the directors and the chairman and everything. Nobody kept anything like that. It's such a pity. And even some of the printing of the gold boxes, in a sheet, it would be a work of art, because they had to employ artists to design the boxes and the printing. And I think my father, he did help to invent what they called a 4-colour machine to print 4 different colours onto the same cardboard or whatever, with a gold background. My uncle went to the States to try and sell the patent of this invention that my father and his staff had invented. There was a telegram from my uncle to say that he had sold the rights, or the what do they call it, the patent.
Mm-hmm.
When he got back to England, he sent this telegram from the boat, or was it a telegram or was it whatever it was. And of course the shares went up like mad. British Cellular and D. Smith and Sons went up leaps and bounds. When he got back to England, it was discovered that the Americans had already got that type of, not the same thing, but something similar, and they weren't interested in my father's invention. So everything collapsed, and members of the board, they absconded to South America. Gordon Liverman, I remember these names, and a Mr. Sumper. No, he wasn't a Mr., he was a JP, and he was an MP, another MP, and a Mr. There were lords on the board. And they disappeared. they'd sold out and left the family. And of course Henry had bought masses of shares, told not to overextend himself. And in a panic he phoned up my father. And my father said, don't worry, we'll take them up. But of course they weren't able to. Every time they bought, the shares were going down. They plummeted from whatever it was, perhaps £3 or £4, they plummeted to 2 or 3 shillings in no time. And but eventually my brother and my uncle and my cousin David got the business together again, and they formed another company, and in 1960 they went public again. And that's when Henry managed to get this £40,000 from David. That's another story.
That's another story. So the business had good times and bad times.
Yes.
And that in the late 30s was one of the bad times.
Yes. And then the war came, and my mother had this massive flat in Benton Close in Regent's Park. It had 7 bedrooms, and she used it as a B&B place, and she'd spoken to the directors of the company that owned the block of flats, and she got this 7-bedroom flat for £5 a week, because everybody was escaping from London, and they didn't have anyone to take up all the slack, all the flats that were there. And it also had the advantage of an underground shelter. And we as youngsters watched the Battle of Britain that was an interesting period of time. And my mother, when the family started the business again, they did it from a little, I don't know, some place in Liverpool Street. She used to have the men, all the people that were in the business, she used to have them staying in the flat, and they used to pay £2 a week for breakfast and dinner. My mother was a fabulous cook, and my Aunt Minnie used to help her, and I think Frida was home at the time, and Mary. So they all helped in the house, and I think she had a maid who used to come in and do the cleaning. And this is how she managed during the war to keep going, and to everyone's advantage, because the men in the business, my brother and my cousin and my uncle, my father, I think during that time had a stroke, and he was not capable of doing very much, but he was staying there, he was living there. And they set up the business again. Eventually, it took a few years, but eventually they got enough money and enough people interested in investing in the company. And it was 1960, or no, it was before 1960. That's when David had the Russian shop, I think, and it was before, now of course it was before 1960, because after she'd left Benton Close, that was during the war, then she moved to Bournemouth. She ran a little hotel in Bournemouth, where my Aunt Minnie met her second husband, and had a wonderful life thereafter. Oh, my mother was marvellous. Not any one of us, 5 children, 6 children, had got or ever had the energy and the whatever it was that she was blessed with. I mean, she dragged the family up from, that's right, she had to sell everything in order to start the business up again. And this is what she did. She pawned and sold everything, her jewellery, because my father was very lavish when he had the money. She looked like a Christmas tree with all her danglings, her earrings, and her brooches in her hat, and on a negligee she used to come down in the morning. But yes, she was always happy, most of the time, apart from, and I think she was very much in love with my father, and they used to get together and have a second honeymoon and a third honeymoon, and she used to have another wardrobe made, and then they used to go away together for a weekend and come back, and she'd be happy for a few months. And then he'd had the wandering eye again, and then he took to drink, of course, after his stroke. So they separated in the end.
Do you know when that was?
Yes, it was in the 50s. Is it on?
It's on and it's recording.
Recording, right. Well, I think I better start with the time that I fell in love with your daddy. I was about 14 at the time, and he was married. He was a friend of Uncle Jack, Uncle Jack was my mother's youngest brother, and he used to go travelling for a couple of the uncles, and he met Henry in Glasgow and became very friendly with him and invited him back to our house because Uncle Jack used to live with us. And that's when I first saw Henry, this dark, handsome man. He was very fascinating. But he had his wife with him, and my mother had a lovely drawing room with gold curtains, and they were sitting behind the curtains, and I drew the pulley and exposed them having a cuddle, and I don't think he ever forgave me for that, but anyhow.
How old were you at that time?
I was only about 14 or 15, and then his wife died. I think they had been married a couple of years, and Jack had seen Henry again and invited him down to London, and thereafter, and of course they lived in Walthamstow. The family had a house in Walthamstow, Henry's family, and he became a constant visitor, sometimes staying overnight, and I was very much in love with him. And then he asked, I think he spoke to my father, and my father agreed to put some money into his business. Not his business, he was just a traveller at that stage, but to buy him a sort of a partnership in this import-export business.
Would you regard...
And they actually imported a lot of stuff from Poland. Bibs and brace, all those overall things, and lots of stuff from Poland.
Would you regard that as a dowry?
Well, it could have, well, they did everything. I mean, they gave us this wonderful wedding. Yes, I suppose it would be, wouldn't it? I was one of 5 girls. Tilly was already spoken for. I don't know, the family, my parents might have been glad, you know, that another daughter was off their hands. So, you know, it's one of those things in big families, I think. And all my sisters were in love with him, all the younger ones. And I think even Tilly had dreams about him. He was very charming and very, I don't know. Oh yeah, and I was very gullible. However, we had a lovely wedding in Park Lane in Grosvenor House, 500 people. And my father being in business and asked all the directors and Lord this and Sir somebody else. Prior to that, we left Cazenove Road round about 36, I think, and we went into a rented flat in Berkeley Street. It was Sir Victor Sassoon's flat, service flat, and it was very posh. And there was a butler who used to bring up some food on silver platters, and I can't tell you. Well, that's the sort of wealth they had. I can't describe to you the sort of life that my parents led at that time, before the fall, before they went bankrupt. But I suppose it's a sort of an extravagance that's bound to bring its downfall. However, after we married, we lived in a service flat, actually, because I became pregnant, I think, about 2 weeks after I was married, if not on the honeymoon. Yes, that's right, because Dappler was born exactly 9 months and 2 weeks after we were married.
Where did you honeymoon, Mum?
We went, south of France. Went on the blue, I think it was the blue train, as they used to call it. It was all very, we went to a lovely hotel, Negresco, I think it's still standing. that was in Nice. But of course we went on different trips. I remember we went on a coach trip into Italy, and we went up the Corniche Road.
The Grand Corniche.
Oh my God! And everybody got out to have photographs taken. But Henry and I, we were petrified. 6,000 feet above sea level, and.
Isn't there a story that one of you got on the floor during the
Oh
trip?
yes, well you know how it was when we went to Italy, crawling on the floor, and Caroline, getting a little bit. But after we came back and from our honeymoon, Henry was gambling even then because he had to send to London for more money. Although we'd had quite a lot of money taken with us. Wedding gifts and the monies that my father had given me and my mother. That had all gone. And I used to sort of be very sleepy, and he used to go off in the afternoon, and he went to the casino. So
As you do.
as you do. Right, I'm going to skip a few years and talk about the time. Oh, it's a pity though, because we had a nice time in Somerset. There were some very happy years. On our, when you were all young and we went to the south of France, to Cannes, I met Lady Docker and Sir Docker, and had great flirtation with him in the casinos actually. But well, things got a bit tricky. He was all right when he had plenty of money, Henry, which he mostly borrowed from didn't borrow because he never paid it back. But I suppose that was the price of marriage. Keeping a roof over my head. And he swore that he would always support me, and even if he had to be an all-night driver in a lorry, he would always look after me, which wasn't quite true. Let me talk. Oh, I don't want to talk about that.
Fine. Well, let us stop there and have a rest for a minute.
Yes, let's have a cup of tea.
It's the 2nd of May 2006. We've had a bit of break since we last filmed. How have you been?
I don't seem to have made a lot of progress, but I have improved. I had my niece here on one of the days, and she said how much better I was. That's Sarah's daughter, Gabriella.
Because you've not been well in the intervening period?
I had a series of problems and ended up in hospital for 3 months, and I couldn't wait to get out. I was prepared to discharge myself, but I think my consultant had pity on me, and she let me come home. But he bought the house in Vivian Way. And of course, during the war, while the bombs were falling, he went to Somerset, and he found a little house, a lovely house, which belonged to Professor Ivermy, who was a professor of music. And it was a beautiful canopied bed in the bedroom, and stone floors, and surrounded by farms. So with Josephine and Davida and a nanny. Yes, Nanny Lawrence, and another member of the staff. We went to this house in Somerset, Nettie and Bertie. Bertie was his younger brother, and Nettie was his wife, and they came to stay with us in Somerset. And I think David was very friendly with Harry Roy, and his sister used to come down for the weekends in Somerset. I don't know how all this is important, but
it's
it was
interesting.
all part of our social life. And I think Harry Roy was married to a princess of Sarawak.
Oh.
Yes, and she lived in Mayfair, and once we came up to London, and she was getting dressed in her flat and walking about in her silk underwear, very natural and beautiful. And I think she came down to Somerset for a weekend, but it was a bit primitive for her, I think.
And after Davida and Josephine were born,
Yes.
and you were living most of the time at this point during the war in Somerset.
Somerset.
When was Robert born?
Robert was born in Somerset,
He-
and we had to get a rabbi from Bristol, I think, because I remember the meal that my sister-in-law Nettie made. It was tongue, I think, or beef. And Henry used to take chickens and ducks back to London that he bought at the farms. We were never short of anything. We had the best milk and eggs that everybody longed to have, and Nettie used to send back eggs for her uncles and her parents and the family, and we did the same for the people in London. And it was a very pleasant life, and this lovely, lovely little cottage. Josephine, we had Nanny Lawrence, who looked after Josephine, used to brush her hair 100 times at night. And we were in Somerset for a couple of years, and then Bob seemed to be, there was a period of relative peace before other bombs started coming down, and then we went back to Somerset, and I don't know whether we ever went back to the same place. Yes, we did, and that was after Robert was born. And after the war, which ended in 1945, we came back to London to Vivian Way, and in 1945 Caroline was born, and in 1950 I had a lovely young son, Julian, who was born. And Henry was going through a very good period at that time. They were doing, there was a boom in manufacturing just after the war, with all the soldiers coming back with their annuities, and there seemed to be a lot of money about, and the business, his manufacturing business, flourished. He quarrelled with his sister, who was a designer of baby wear, and he quarrelled with his younger brother, and they separated, and they went their way in competition, so he had a bit of a hard time. And of course it meant more monies, and he got involved with a solicitor, Harkerby, who forged, he had persuaded my mother in the 60s to ask my brother to start up a business with him in news agencies, and he bought 6 shops at very reasonable prices, one in Richmond and one in Chiswick, and a lovely little Queen Anne shop in Brighton, Kemp Town it was. And David had insisted that they should be in our joint names, my name and his name, Henry's name. But then Henry persuaded me to transfer everything over to him, which I did, being a very devoted wife, and David was rather cross. And over the years, David put in about £50,000, or £40,000 or £50,000 into their partnership. Henry had managers for his shops most of the time, and he had started planning to have his revenge on the family, which I now recall very vividly. And he got involved with this solicitor, who forged my signature on documents, because I owned several of the shops, or partly owned them, and I owned the house. Well, Henry put it in my name, and he'd forged my signature, and he eventually was found out and was sent to prison. But that was after David had hired all this money into help Henry.
And we're talking about the solicitor who was jailed and sent to prison.
He was jailed, and then Henry decided he was going to blackmail this solicitor, because apparently he had a lot of money to help his father. What did he? I have got a paper when he had his court case. He wanted to help his father, and it was an easy way to get monies from all these properties that people had put into his care. And Henry decided that he was going to blackmail him, and I was absolutely horrified, because I now realised in the 60s, late 60s, that Henry was not the wonderful person that I'd always thought he was.
And what sort of effect did this have on your family life? I think this doesn't happen in Hollywood. The phone's going, cut, sue that person. We'll take a break there. So we're resuming in the 60s, and you're finding out that your husband is dragging money from your brother, that he has a solicitor friend who has forged your signature. The solicitor goes to prison. Your husband wants to further blackmail him prior to this. How did this affect your relationship? How did it affect the family relationship?
Our relationship over the last year was a bit fraught. We had a sort of a physical liking for one another. I'd shifted into another bedroom, and Henry used to come knocking on the door and barging in and demanding his rights. And eventually we just sort of, Henry used to be out almost every night playing cards. I don't quite know what I did. I think I read the Times book of quotations. I was not very, and Julian was still quite young, and he was in the house, and he used to comfort me. Yes, you did, do you remember? And very often, he used to go and visit Charlie, because Charlie had a nurse who was very attractive, and Henry used to go up there almost every night if he was not playing cards. And then I heard from a friend that he was having an affair with somebody that he was playing bridge with, and when I think about it, I think he must have had quite a few over the years, but didn't seem to affect me. And I somehow didn't mind, and I think even he took me to a solicitor for me to say that I wouldn't mind if he had an affair. So I mean, he should have been a solicitor, because he knew all the tricks. Anyhow, I was so enraged when he told me that he was going to blackmail this solicitor that I dragged a painting from a wall in our house, and I just crowned him with it. And of course the painting, the canvas broke, and I think I left him at this stage.
It's this painting up here, yes?
Oh, yes.
You smashed a Dutch painting over his head. This was what, in the...
It must have done. I threw a bowl of flowers on the floor, and of course he phoned up the doctor and said my wife has gone mad, and of course I left and went to a hotel in the West End somewhere.
This would be in the late 60s, would it, Mum?
About 68, 69, I think. And what his plan was, as I realised later on, as David was his partner, and he didn't care what happened in the shops, and if there were debts mounting up, David as a partner would be responsible. If things failed for Henry, David would be responsible for all the debts. And that, I realised this, and there were letters going backwards and forwards, and I wouldn't let Henry read some of the letters from David, and that caused a lot of friction and a lot of rows. And
so not a happy time.
no, it was a very unhappy time. We had a lovely dog at that stage, a Smarty, was it?
Sparky.
Sparky.
Spaniel, golden spaniel.
And he didn't like Charlie. He used to come over and rustle papers, and he used to bark and not bite him on the trouser leg, but almost. And he used to guard me somehow. Whenever Henry shouted at me, he would bark at him. Yes, late in the 60s, I just couldn't cope with it any longer, and as I say, I crowned him with this painting and threw a bowl of flowers on the carpet. Apparently, he'd phoned Robert, and Robert came to take me away, take me to his house, which he had in Hampstead Garden Sub, a little small house with a dog, and stayed there for a couple of nights, and then I went to a hotel in the West End, and he happened to phone my mother, and she said, well, she must come to me, which I did. She lived in Sheffield Terrace in a big flat, and I stayed there for about 18 months with her, during which time Henry wanted to get back, and he was very cunning. He knew that I wouldn't, but he made out as if he was terribly hurt. In the meantime, he had a girlfriend, so it was a traumatic time for me. And the solicitor, I had bad advice from the solicitor, unfortunately. And then when it came to the divorce and the separation of the family home, when I agreed to having certain things, he would change his mind. It went on for a couple of years, and I was getting worn down. I lost a couple of stone in weight because of all that. I just couldn't cope with him. And his,
Now, what are you going to have to eat? I've got plenty.
Do you want me to take something round?
I think they were taken actually with black market stuff. And we did have fresh. We had butter, we had eggs, we had chicken. Yeah. And
I remember the meat man coming round. Oh, the chicken man. And the old man, my old man, bringing kosher meat.
Every Friday, every weekend, Charlie came down with
And I
kosher
remember
meat.
Bertie going out and getting nuts. I was remember on his motorbike. Bertie had a motorbike, didn't he?
Yes, that's right. And I went on it every day before you know it. When he worked night work, I used to.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Sylvia. Happy birthday to you. 88 more years. 88 more years.
You want some cake?
Frida will.
Oh, I see.
Wait a minute, wait a minute. It's getting there, isn't it?
Reuben's is an orange.
Yeah, I just want to get a shot of the sisters.
I'm taking the photograph of them.
Thank you. Because when we went to Caroline's sister in Spain,
I hadn't realised since my divorce and after several years quite getting used to a different lifestyle, I felt exhilarated. And I can't believe how independent I have become. I lived with my mother for a year in Kensington, or 18 months I think, and then I lived with Caroline for 4 years, I believe, and my sister for a year, and then Henry and I, through David Pinto, heard about the house in which I now live.
Robert.
Yeah. Who did I say?
He who shall not be talked about. You said Henry.
Yeah. Oh no. And I've joined the local education society, or the local. I went to criminology, went to the Old Bailey when those brothers that were tried.
Oh, the nice Cray twins.
Oh, the Cray twins.
Those very nice people.
I was not at their trial. I went with the tutor, John Griffiths. His name was the same name as our John, actually. And went into the Old Bailey and then went down to lunch, and used to read the Financial Times. I used to know what price all the shares were. Well, not all of them, obviously, but I remember when the stock market climbed to 500. Now it's 6,000, I believe. I joined, yes, I was on the student committee at the tender age of about 59 or 60. I was on the academic board, and yes, of the adult education in where was it? In Westminster, and on the academic board and the governing body.
Yeah.
And there were, every year, you know, we had our little booklets put out, and I wish I had kept some of them because my name was on all these committees, and I was very proud that I had become so independent. And I think in those days David was married, Robert was married. You were still quite young, weren't you? Josephine had gone to America, and Caroline was married. And I had all the free time. I didn't see that much of my children in those days. I was so preoccupied with all my studies, and then I went into something that I had longed to do for some time, and that was restoring old china. And quite a few plates that I've got hanging on my walls have been restored by myself. And I did one or two bits for friends, but I don't think I was ever good enough to be a professional, but I enjoyed being with the group of people. But then I became very arthritic. Are you doing me?
I'm listening.
And had to stop going to these classes, but I went to musical appreciation and other classes at the time.
You got yourself a life.
I got myself alive, especially when we came here, and Robert settled me in and got some furniture in, and after a time I got some of the furniture from our house in Vivian Way, and gradually built up a nice social life for myself.
Well, you can see from the videos of your parties what a big social world. Your children obviously adore you, but you have a big social circle of friends who keep in touch.
I have. And there are pictures to prove it. Everybody took pictures yesterday. Anthony, good. I think Anthony's got loads of pictures of me over the years. He used to be very good. And still is, actually. He phones me 2 or 3 times a week. Used to go to his house quite a lot.
Yes, a life.
A life. I've got a life, and now I'm 88, yes. I had one of my great-grandchildren came up to me yesterday and said, I'm 8 years old. And I said, yes, I know, and I'm 88. I'm 80 years older than you, darling. And it was a lovely, lovely, lovely day yesterday. I think, about 20 odd people here.
Well, I think more.
About 25, 28 people here with children, more. Up to 30, I would think. And the children played in the garden downstairs, and Kate and Susie came up. And a lot of my local friends, and Auntie Nettie, who will be 91 in May, and 20th of May, actually. It's amazing.
It is amazing. An amazing life. Thank you, Mum.
Okay.
Thank you.
I don't think there's... You tell me when you're ready.
I'm ready for you, Mum.
Right. Where are we? We're in almost at the beginning of June. And 2006.
That's the one.
And I'd just like to say that although my marriage to Henry had good times and bad times, the most rewarding part of it was that I've got 5 wonderful children who are now all adults, but they are so caring and loving, and I don't think I could have survived without their care and love over the last 30 odd years. And I can't speak too highly of them, and I just realise how fortunate and lucky I am that as a result of our union, my union with Henry, that I've got these wonderful, wonderful people who are so loving and caring and have helped me to carry on with a reasonable, lovely life. And I feel very much for them, and my lovely great-grandchildren and grandchildren, and I just feel that I'm very, very fortunate. In spite of all my disabilities and pains, I can reflect on the wonderful, wonderful life I've led since I've been alone, and how caring and loving they all have been, helped sustain me.
Okay, I think that's great.